Welcome, intrepid explorers of the unknown. Prepare yourselves for a thrilling journey into the core of human mysteries and the untapped powers that dwell within each of us. Today, we open the doors to a realm that transcends the known laws of physics and reality, where minds communicate beyond words and ideas traverse the cosmos without the need for the senses. We proudly present to you The Power of Telepathy, a brilliant work by William Walker Atkinson, a visionary whose legacy resonates through the halls of esoteric wisdom. In this compelling text, Atkinson masterfully leads us through the intricate corridors of the human mind, unveiling the remarkable phenomenon of telepathy, the ability to transmit thoughts and emotions from one mind to another without relying on physical senses. Imagine a universe where the boundaries of time and space vanish under the sheer force of thought. In this extraordinary domain, distance becomes meaningless and physical limitations crumble. Each chapter of Atkinson's work serves as a gateway into the stunning reality of how our minds can connect on profound levels, and how this power has the potential to reshape our understanding of both the world and ourselves. As we embark on this journey, Atkinson presents astonishing accounts of telepathic phenomena that defy logic, offering compelling evidence and theories that have confounded both scientists and mystics alike. Together we will explore stories of mental connections that transcend all limits and extraordinary events that challenge our very perception of reality. So put on your headphones and get ready for an unparalleled adventure. Leave behind the mundane and plunge into a world of limitless mental potential. With each word, you'll uncover the hidden mysteries of telepathy, and perhaps by the time this journey ends, you will discover within your own thoughts the key to unlocking your highest potential. Let us now begin this journey into the realm of telepathic power and allow the magic of the mind to transport us to unimaginable heights. In preparing this set of lessons for Western students, I found myself compelled to follow guidelines that were exactly opposite to those I would have chosen if these teachings were intended for students in India. Indeed, the mental attitudes of students from these two countries are very different. The Indian student expects the teacher to positively present the principles to be addressed and the methods by which these principles can manifest, often accompanied by illustrations, usually in the form of fables or parables, serving to connect the new knowledge to something already known. In reality, the Hindu student never expects or demands any proof of the teacher's principles or methods. In fact, they would consider it an insult to the teacher to request such proof. Therefore, they neither seek nor ask for specific examples or illustrations in the form of scientific evidence or validation of the taught principles. They may ask for more information, but only to clarify a point they do not understand, while carefully avoiding any question that might indicate a discussion, doubt about what is being taught, or a request for evidence and proof. The Western student, on the other hand, is accustomed to maintaining a skeptical attitude, a critical posture of doubt, and a need for evidence. The teacher who instructs them understands this. Both parties are used to illustrations manifesting the principles discussed, but these illustrations should not be fanciful or figurative. They should concern real, well-authenticated, and validated cases as evidence. In summary, it is expected that the Western teacher actually proves their principles and methods to their students before expecting them to be accepted in their entirety. This is not due to doubt or real suspicion about the teacher's truthfulness or capability, but simply because the Western mind expects to question and be questioned in the process of teaching and learning. Thus, in this set of lessons, I have tried to follow the Western method rather than the Hindu one. As much as possible, I have avoided affirmative statements of principles and methods, and I have sought to demonstrate each step of the teaching. Of course, I had to assume the existence of certain fundamental principles to avoid lengthy, technical, metaphysical, and philosophical discussions. I also had to be content with the simple and positive assertion of the existence of the astral plane, the Akashic records, prana, and other fundamental postulates of Hindu philosophy and occult science, given that they are established solely by the experience of those who are capable of acting in the higher planes. Beyond all of this, I have tried to demonstrate with direct and positive evidence, suited to the Western mindset, each step of my teaching and methods. In providing this scientific evidence, I have deliberately omitted, except in a few cases, any mention of occult or psychic phenomena that occurred in India, and have limited myself to citing cases that happened in Western lands. Furthermore, I have avoided citing Hindu authorities and instead mentioned recognized and respected personalities in the West, such as the Society for Psychical Research and scientists interested in the work of this society. In this way, I aim to provide Western students with examples, cases, and illustrations with which they are familiar. Had I mentioned cases from India, I might have been accused of providing scarcely recognized evidence and citing individuals unknown to my readers. Naturally, there is a wealth of such cases and illustrations in India, but generally they are traditional and not available in written format. Additionally, they would probably not be very satisfactory for Western students. I must, however, affirm that although all these cases, illustrations, and citations are purely Western, the principles they illustrate and prove are among the oldest known to Hindu occult science and philosophy. Indeed, having been accepted as proven truths in India for several centuries, there is little demand for further proof from Hindus. In the Western world, however, these concepts are virtually new and therefore need to be proven and legitimized. Thus, as I have already stated, I have adjusted the fabric of my teachings to fit the requirements of Western academic standards. Regarding illustrations and cases, the citations and examples are purely Western and familiar to the student, but concerning the principles themselves, this is another matter. Forgive me for stating that these originate from Hindu thought and research, and anyone wishing to discover their roots should then investigate the tree of Eastern wisdom, which has withstood the storms and winds of thousands of years. The branches of this mighty tree extend widely, and there is enough space for many Western students to rest in its shade and find refuge. In these lessons, I have occasionally cited two small books titled The Astral World and The Human Aura. Those interested in these subjects will find these texts useful. They are sold at a nominal price and contain much information that will be useful to students of Hindu occult science. However, they are not necessary to complete the understanding of the topics covered in these lessons and are mentioned and recommended as supplementary reading. I use the term clairvoyance in the broad sense of astral perception, in contrast to perception through physical senses. As we progress, you will discover the general and specific meanings of the term, so there is no need to provide a particular definition or illustration at this stage. Telepathy, on the other hand, can be understood as the sending and receiving of thought messages and mental and emotional states, whether conscious or unconscious, through what might be called the sixth sense. There is, of course, a form of thought transfer on the astral plane, but I include it under the general term of clairvoyance for reasons that will be explained later. In the previous chapter, if you recall, I mentioned that, in addition to the 5 ordinary physical senses of humans, there are also 2 other relatively underdeveloped physical senses in the average person. These 2 additional physical senses are the sense of the presence of other living beings and the telepathic sense. As I also mentioned, these 2 extra-physical senses have their astral counterparts. Similarly, some physical organs, unrecognized by physiologists or psychologists but well recognized by all occultists, have these counterparts. I will now examine the first of these 2 subtle senses with the aim of clarifying the distinction between ordinary telepathy and this form of clairvoyance, which is its astral counterpart. Every human being has a sense that is not recognized as such, although almost everyone has had more or less an experience related to its functioning. I am referring to the sense of the presence of other living beings, which is distinct from the operation of each of the 5 ordinary physical senses. I ask you to understand that I am not asserting that this sense is superior to the other 5, or that it appeared in humans at an advanced state of evolution. On the contrary, this sense appeared in living beings at an earlier stage of evolution. The higher forms of lower animals, such as horses, dogs, and most wild beasts, possess it. Savage and barbaric humans have it more developed than civilized individuals. Indeed, this physical sense might be considered superfluous in civilized humans, as it has not been actively used for many generations. In this regard, the physical sense of smell would also be deficient in humans, as, on the other hand, in lower animals and savage humans, smell is very acute. I mention this to avoid any misunderstanding. In my small book, The Astral World, I wrote the following. All occultists know that humans actually possess 7 senses instead of 5, although the 2 additional senses are not sufficiently developed for use in the average person. However, Occultists generally use them by deploying them. Some have interpreted this as if the occultist were developing these two additional physical senses in the same manner as certain higher psychic or astral faculties. But this idea is mistaken. The occultist, in this case, merely awakens these two senses which have been almost lost by humanity, by developing them through use and exercise in order to bring them to a wonderful level of competence for use on the physical plane. Thus, in this sense, the perception of the presence of other living beings is highly evolved in lower animals, particularly in those whose safety depends on knowing the presence of their natural enemies. As might be expected, wild animals have this sense more developed than domestic animals. Yet even among the latter, we find examples of this sense being activated, as is the case with dogs, horses, or geese. Who among us is not familiar with the strange behaviors of a dog or a horse when the animal perceives the invisible presence of someone or something? We often reprimand or punish the animal for its particular actions simply because we are unable to see what is disturbing it. How many times does a dog suddenly start running and bristle its fur when there seems to be nothing in sight or nothing to hear? How many times does a horse become frightened or even panic when there is apparently nothing outside? Domestic birds, especially geese, exhibit distress in response to the presence of unfamiliar people or animals, even though they cannot see or hear them. It is a historical fact that once a flock of wild geese saved ancient Rome from an enemy attack. The night was dark and stormy, and the trained vision and keen hearing of the Roman sentries could not detect the enemy's approach. However, the sharp senses of the geese detected the presence of foreign men, and they began to honk loudly, waking the guard. Thus, Rome was saved. Skeptics have tried to explain this historical case with the theory that the geese heard the enemy approaching, but this explanation is invalid. Indeed, the Roman soldiers were stationed and on guard, and the geese remained silent until they perceived the approach of a small number of enemy scouts, at which point they burst into wild cries. The ancient Romans had little doubt about this. They recognized the existence of an unusual power in the geese and gave them all the credit. Hunters in wild and unknown lands have often reported that, while they were hidden in hopes of shooting the nearest wild animals, they witnessed this strange faculty in wild beasts. Although they could not see or smell the hidden hunters, as the wind was blowing in the opposite direction, suddenly one or more of the animals, usually an adult female, would immediately move away. Then, one could see a shiver running through their bodies, followed by a faint warning sound, and the rest of the group would scatter. Almost all hunters have had the experience of observing the prey they hope to capture suddenly fleeing, shaken with nerves, without having waited to sniff the air as usual and running hastily. Additionally, it is known that many predator animals perceive the presence of their natural prey even when the wind is against them, and there are no sounds or movements emitted by the frightened, curled-up animal. Some birds seem to detect the presence of certain worms they feed on, even if they are buried in the ground or under tree bark. The savage man also possesses this developed faculty. As observed by all travelers and explorers, he is as keen as wild animals in sensing the proximity of enemies, or in some cases, the approach of man-eating beasts. This does not mean that these savages are more developed than civilized man, but rather the opposite. The explanation is as follows. When man became civilized and protected himself from wild enemies, as well as sudden attacks from human rivals, this sense began to diminish. Eventually, over generations, it became almost obsolete due to disuse and ceased to inform the brain or other nervous centers. In other words, the nervous centers and brain began to pay less and less attention to signals from this sense and became more focused on sight and hearing until consciousness could no longer be awakened by familiar sounds such as the noise of machinery in the workshop or ordinary noises in the home, even though the ears receive sound waves. This is how this sense, neglected for the two mentioned reasons, is almost unknown to the average citizen. I said almost unknown because this is not entirely the case. Probably each of us has had experiences where we actually felt the presence of a stranger at a location. The effect of this sense is particularly noticeable in the region of the solar plexus or lower abdomen. It manifests as a peculiar and unpleasant feeling of emptiness in that area, accompanied by a sense of discomfort that produces a strange disturbance, often accompanied by a sensation of chills or fear along the spine. The organs that record the presence of a foreign or external creature are certain nerves located on the surface of the skin, generally connected to the roots of body hair or situated where such hair would naturally be present. In the case of skin that lacks these nerves, they seem to directly inform the solar plexus, which then reacts reflexively by affecting other parts of the body, causing an instinctive sensation to flee or crouch and hide. This feeling, as can be immediately observed, is a legacy from our wild ancestors or perhaps from our primitive animal roots. It is a very unpleasant sensation, and humanity is spared many discomforts due to its relative absence. I said that occultists have developed, or to be more precise, redeveloped this sense. They do so to possess a harmonious and well-developed system of 7 senses, as it enhances their overall awareness. Other knowledge possessed by the occultist neutralizes the unpleasant aspects of this sense, and it is often found to be a very valuable complement to their senses of sight and hearing, particularly in cases where individuals with hostile or antagonistic feelings approach them. Indeed, in such situations, this faculty activates in a very particular way in relation to the telepathic sense, which will be described later. This sense manifests to give a person a warning when someone with unfriendly feelings is approaching, regardless of how friendly their outward appearance may seem. These 2 additional senses combine to provide an instinctive warning sensation that we all know from personal experience. This sense, just like the telepathic one, can be cultivated or developed by anyone who wishes to dedicate time and effort to it. The principle is very simple. It is the same as developing any other physical attribute, namely through use and exercise. The first step is to recognize the existence of the sense itself. The next is to pay attention to its signals, and the final step is frequent use and exercise. One should think of how to act to develop one of the 5 ordinary senses, such as hearing, sight, or touch, and then apply the same practice process to this additional sense or these 2 senses, and the same results will be achieved. Now let us consider the other extra-physical sense, the telepathic sense, or the ability to perceive the thought waves or emotional vibrations of other people. As strange as it may seem to some people, in fact to the vast majority, this telepathic ability is not a superior sense, but rather comparatively inferior, just like the sense we have just described. Many lower animals and primitive and wild humans possess this sense to a more developed degree. What is truly superior in this category of psychic phenomena is the manifestation of this higher form of telepathy through the use of the astral counterpart of this sense, which we will consider later under the term clairvoyance, as it is actually the particular phase of clairvoyance. As strange as it may seem, some higher animals possess a certain type of telepathic sense. An animal is generally aware of the feelings and intentions others have towards it. Domestic animals lose some of this sense due to generations spent in safety, while wild animals have it highly developed. Yet even some domestic animals retain this sense to some degree. This fact can be easily recognized if one has ever attempted to isolate a specific animal from a herd or pack. One will realize that the animal somehow perceives the decision made about it, regardless of whether the person approaches discreetly or seemingly disinterested. The animal will begin to move around other animals, twisting from the inside out. In their efforts to hide, the other animals also seem to know that this particular animal is being sought and will show little fear or distrust towards the victim. I have often observed this in my country and elsewhere among poultry farmers. The farmer will likely think, "Now I will catch that black hen with yellow legs, the one that is big and clumsy." He will approach the group slowly, pretending indifference, but as soon as he gets closer to the creatures, the black hen will move to an outer space on the opposite side from the man. When the owner moves to his side, he will realize that the animal has blended into the crowd, making it difficult to find. Sometimes it tries to sneak away and hide in a dark corner or behind a large object. Every poultry farmer will smile when this fact is mentioned, as he knows from experience that hens have a way of perceiving what he thinks of them. Additionally, as every farmer knows, crows have a very strange way of perceiving the intentions of the farmer trying to destroy them, and they show great cunning in avoiding these intentions. But although the crow is a very intelligent bird, in fact, one of the wisest in the bird family, it gains its knowledge of what is happening in the human mind, not only by guessing intentions, but rather through this instinctive perception of mental states. The hen, as is well known, is a very clumsy bird that shows little intelligent activity. However, it is very quick to perceive the farmer's intentions towards it, even if it generally lacks the skill to plan an intelligent escape. Every owner of dogs, cats, and horses has observed the manifestation of this sense in these animals many times. Every dog senses its owner's emotional states, as well as those of other people. The horse knows when its owner intends to put the bridle around its neck, or conversely, when he is merely walking in the fields. Cats perceive their owner's feelings and thoughts, and often react to them. Of course, lower animals can only perceive basic mental states and generally emotional states, as their minds are not developed to interpret more complex mental states. Humans also instinctively perceive the feelings and intentions of others. They do not reason about it, but simply sense the ideas and intentions of others. Women from lower races are more adept than men at interpreting these sensory signals. Generally, women are more sensitive than men at every level of development. When we consider ordinary telepathy in civilized men, we find a more complex state. Although the civilized man as a whole has lost some of the rapid telepathic perception of lower races, he has gained, in some exceptional cases, the ability to receive and interpret more complex forms of thought and mental states. Research by the Society for Psychical Research, as well as by private investigators, has shown us that an image of a complex geometric drawing retained in one person's mind can be transmitted and received by another person's mind, which reproduces the drawing on paper. Similarly, difficult thoughts have been transmitted and received, but these are only exceptional cases. In many situations, this sense seems almost extinguished in the ordinary civilized individual, except when it is awakened in exceptional moments. However, the majority of people occasionally display telepathy, enough to realize that there is something within them. The renewed interest in the subject in recent years has drawn public attention to telepathic phenomena, and as a result, more and more people are attentive to cases of thought transfer that come to their personal knowledge. It is important to remember, of course, that we constantly receive thought waves and feel their influence unconsciously. I am referring only to the conscious perception of thought waves. Many researchers have developed their telepathic sense to the point of achieving remarkable results in tests at times. However, it has been disappointing for many of them to find that, under other circumstances, under seemingly similar conditions, their success was very limited. This is so true that many authorities have adopted the theory that telepathy is more or less spontaneous and cannot be produced voluntarily. This theory is true to some extent because there is an aspect that these researchers overlook, probably due to their lack of knowledge of the occult principles involved in the phenomena. I am referring to the fact that their most brilliant successes were achieved through the unconscious activation of the astral telepathic sense, that is, clairvoyance. When in this state, they achieved surprising results, but the next time, when they tried, they failed to activate the astral sense and therefore had to rely entirely on the physical telepathic sense, which led to relatively mediocre results. One can understand the difference and distinction between physical telepathy and astral telepathy by carefully examining the nature of each, as I will present now. It is essential to pay particular attention to what I will say on this topic in the following pages of this chapter. One should not dismiss these explanations as boring, as without a clear fundamental understanding of the subject, one will never achieve better results. This is true in all phases of learning, whether physical or psychic. One must start correctly to achieve the best goals. First, every thought process, emotional activity, or idea creation is accompanied by a manifestation of force. In reality, it is the result of this force. Without delving deeply into what the mind itself is, we can firmly adhere to the natural fact that any manifestation of mental or emotional activity is the result of an action of the brain or nervous system, which manifests as vibrations. Just as in the case of electrical manifestation, certain chemical elements are consumed or transformed. In the case of mental or emotional activity, there is a consumption or transformation of the substance that composes the nervous system. When I speak of the nervous system, I include the brain, that is, the brains of man, as they are merely a part of his large nervous system where all emotional or mental activity manifests. Moreover, just as there is no true destruction of matter in any of nature's processes, as apparent destruction is merely transformation, in our case, there is a transformation of the energy released in the mental or emotional process. We can understand this idea more clearly if we consider what happens during the transformation of electrical energy. For example, If a strong electric current is passed through a thin wire or a carbon filament, the current will transform into light. If another type of transmission channel is used, the current will transform into heat. Any electric light or heating device is evidence of this. Similarly, electrical current is sent through space in the form of wireless waves. These waves, when coming into contact with certain types of devices, are transformed into forms of force that are recorded and interpreted by the wireless operator. Likewise, telepathic energy waves are sent out by the activity released from a state of thought or emotion. These waves travel in all directions, and when they encounter sufficiently sensitive physical devices, they can be reproduced or transformed into mental or emotional states similar to those originally sent. When talking on the telephone, sound waves are converted into electrical waves. These electrical waves are transmitted through wires, and when they reach the other end of the telephone circuit, they are converted back into sound waves that the receiver's ear hears. Similarly, when your brain sends out thought waves, they travel until they are received by another person's brain, where they are transformed back into thoughts of the same type as those that originally generated the thought waves. I will explain this topic further in the next chapter. I pause here to emphasize the difference between the phenomena of this type of telepathy and the higher form, which is a phase of clairvoyance. In the case of what can be called clairvoyant telepathy or astral telepathy, ordinary thought waves play a minor role. Instead of these waves, there is a transmission of force along the channels of the astral plane. It is almost impossible to describe the phenomena of the astral plane in physical terms. I can illustrate this topic generally by saying that it is somewhat similar to how the astral self extends to the astral self of another person, and thus actually perceives the astral activities. Rather than being waves moving through space between brains, this can be understood more clearly. This is the closest description I can give of the subject. Telepathy is simply a matter of transmitting and receiving waves of vibratory force that have traveled through the atmosphere between two people. But clairvoyance or astral telepathy is something like the mind actually extending to touch the mind of another person and what is within it. I will explain much more about how the processes of clairvoyance work as we proceed. I have limited myself to giving this explanation to distinguish between ordinary telepathy and clairvoyance, to avoid common misunderstandings. Now let's consider ordinary telepathy phenomena, which in itself is very marvelous, although it operates at a lower level of activity compared to its astral or clairvoyant counterpart. The term telepathy, which means the transfer of thought, is somewhat misleading. Its literal meaning is to suffer from a distance, or perhaps to feel pain at a distance. In reality, the name should indicate knowing at a distance to be properly descriptive. But since the term has acquired a set meaning due to years of usage, it will likely continue to be understood in this way. After all, names matter little as long as the meaning is accepted and understood. Although the term itself has generally been used in the sense of the conscious and deliberate sending and receiving of thought waves, there is a much broader field of phenomena it covers. It involves the unconscious sending and receiving of mental and emotional vibrations. I will address this aspect of the subject later. After distinguishing the mechanism by which thought and emotion waves are transmitted in the previous chapter, I emphasized that there is a manifestation of energy or force in the form of vibrations in every mental or emotional state. This is true not only in the case of deep thought or genuine feeling, but also in the case of general mental feelings and emotional states. During these manifestations, there is a radiation of mental or emotional vibrations spreading from the brain or nervous system centers in all directions, much like light and wireless electricity. The primary centers or seats of these radiations are first, the different parts of the human brain, namely the brain, cerebellum, and medulla oblongata respectively, and second, the various large centers of nerve substance in the human system called plexuses, such as the solar plexus. The vibrations arising from emotional excitation are primarily sent from the plexuses or large centers of the sympathetic nervous system, while those from strictly mental states emanate from certain centers and points in the brain of the person manifesting them. Some forms of these vibrations constitute the true essence of what is generally called human magnetism, which will be developed further. I do not believe it is appropriate to explain the technical details of the generation and transmission mechanism of these mental and emotional vibrations throughout these lessons. To understand them would require a technical knowledge of physiology and organic chemistry that the average person does not possess. Furthermore, these details are neither interesting nor instructive for the general student of occultism. However, I find it appropriate to provide at least a brief description of how these vibratory waves are received by other individuals. First, each major plexus or group of nerve ganglia acts as a receiving station in the human system, just like a transmitting station. A person who manifests strong emotional excitement tends to awaken similar states in the nerve centers of others when conditions are favorable. This would explain why vibrations of anger, fear, or panic are contagious. It also explains the strong effect of vibrations from the nerve centers controlling the reproductive system in certain cases of intense sexual excitement. Each human sympathetic nervous system contains many receiving stations where emotional vibrations are received and frequently transform into similar feelings in the receiving system, unless neutralized by other mental and emotional states of the person. When we consider the apparatus by which vibrations from what can be called purely mental brain operations, such as intellectual thought or constructive imagination, are received, we find a more specialized arrangement. There are several minor points of reception for mental vibrations, which I do not find necessary to detail due to the technical characteristics involved. The apparatus for receiving mental vibrations of this type is what is known as the pineal gland, which I will describe below. The pineal gland is a specific mass of nerve substance embedded in the human brain, located near the center of the skull, almost directly above the upper end of the spinal column. It has the shape of a small cone and is grayish-red in color. It is situated in front of the cerebellum and is attached to the floor of the third ventricle of the brain. It contains a small amount of particular sandy substances, often called brain sand. Its scientific name is due to its shape, which, as I mentioned, resembles a cone. Physiologists do not know the function of this strange organ and generally state that its functions are not understood. However, occultists know that the pineal gland, with its particular arrangement of nerve cell corpuscles and tiny grains of brain sand, is the physical instrument for telepathic reception. Wireless telegraphy experts have noted a remarkable resemblance between the pineal gland and a part of the receiving instrument used in this type of telegraphy. The thought vibrations that come into contact with the receiver's nervous system establish a particular vibration in the substance of the pineal gland, thus taking the first step in transforming these vibrations into thought forms in the recipient's mind. The rest of the process is too technical in physiological and occult terms to be treated in detail in this text. The student will benefit from an understanding of how wireless telegraphy works, as this will give them a correct idea of how ordinary telepathy functions without resorting to complex diagrams and technical descriptions. Now let's look at what results from the sending and receiving of these mental and emotional waves of force and energy. I assure you this is a very interesting topic. Although phenomena on the astral plane are probably more fascinating to the average student, I want to emphasize the importance of mastering the occult phenomena of the physical plane before moving on to those of the higher planes. First, as all occultists know, each person is constantly surrounded by what is called an atmosphere composed of mental and emotional vibrations emanating from their personality. The atmosphere of each person depends on the general character of their thoughts and feelings. Therefore, since no two people are exactly alike in their character, it follows that no two personal atmospheres are identical. Each individual has their own psychic atmosphere. These atmospheric vibrations do not extend very far from the person's presence, and thus never affect those who approach them. Similarly, each group or crowd of people has its own psychic atmosphere, composed of a mixture of the individual psychic atmospheres of all the people in a community, group, or assembly, and representing the general average of the crowd's thoughts and feelings. There are no two identical group atmospheres for the same reason that there are no two identically similar groups of people, large or small. Actors know that each audience they face has its own psychic atmosphere and is affected by it. Preachers, lawyers, and speakers in general are very aware of this fact and openly admit it, although they do not know the causes or laws governing this phenomenon. Following the same psychic law, we find that each people or city, or even each small village or section of a large city, has its distinctive psychic atmosphere, which is very perceptible to outsiders visiting the place and affects those who begin to live there. In large cities, It has been observed that each building has its own particular vibrations, resulting from the general character of those who occupy it. Different church buildings also reflect the character of the general habits of thought and feeling of those who hold services there. In the same way, some commercial streets have pleasant or unpleasant vibrations in their atmosphere due to similar causes. Everyone recognizes the truth of these statements, though few are able to explain the facts scientifically. The novice student in psychic phenomena often wonders how these things occur when the thought that originally caused the vibrations has long since disappeared. The explanation is simple when properly formulated. It is somewhat similar to how heat persists in a room after the heater has stopped producing heat waves. Similarly, thought and feeling vibrations persist long after the original thought or feeling has vanished. Or to use a more concrete example, it's like when a perfume bottle has been opened in a room and, even after it has been removed, the air remains imbued with the scent for a long time. Thus, as you can see, the same principle applies to psychic vibrations. A person has the general atmosphere of their most significant mental and emotional vibrations, and similarly, a house, shop, church, street, village or city becomes imbued with the psychic vibrations of those who have been there. Almost everyone notices the different sensation they feel when entering an unfamiliar house, apartment, shop or church. Each has a different psychic effect, and thus each person creates their psychic effect on those who come into contact with them or who are in their presence or vicinity. The next thoughtful question that a novice student might ask is, if people constantly emit psychic vibrations and these persist for some time, why are we not overwhelmed by their force, and why are they not all so mixed that they lose all their effect? I will address this important question below. Firstly, although we are constantly affected by the multitude of psychic vibrations we encounter, most of them do not consciously impress us. For example, consider the few sounds or images from a busy street that are imprinted on our mind. We only hear and see certain things that capture our attention or interest. The rest escapes us, even though our eyes and ears receive it all. Similarly, only the strongest vibrations impress us, and only those that we have drawn to ourselves or that better match our own tastes. Secondly, the effect of some thought vibrations is neutralized by the effect of opposing vibrations. Just as a mixture of black and white produces the neutral color gray, two currents of opposing thought vibrations tend to merge into a neutral vibration that has little or no effect on those who come into contact with them. Many examples of this can be observed in the material world. For instance, a mixture of hot and cold water will produce a neutral warm liquid, which is neither hot nor cold. Similarly, two things with opposing flavors, when mixed, will produce a neutral taste with little effect on the palate. The principle is universal and can be easily understood. Thirdly, there is what we can call an affinity between thoughts and feelings of a similar character. Not only do similar thought vibrations tend to join and combine, but each of us also attracts towards ourselves the thought vibrations that generally align with the thoughts of our own mind or the feelings of our own nature, like attracts like. Similarly, the character of our thoughts and feelings acts to repel opposing or discordant thought and emotional vibrations. As all occultists know, each person attracts thought vibrations that are on the same frequency and also rejects thought vibrations that are not harmonious. These are the general laws and principles governing phenomena at this stage of telepathic vibrations. Of course, there is more to be said on the subject. By paying attention to the main principles and laws of manifestation that we have just mentioned, one can reason correctly about any phase of these phenomena. Once a general rule is learned, the rest becomes a simple matter of application and interpretation. Let us now move on to other phases that also form part of the general subject of telepathic influence. We now arrive at what might be called direct telepathy, that is, when a thought is consciously and intentionally directed towards another person. There are many interesting cases of this type where people find themselves intensely thinking about others and then say things like, "I was thinking about you intensely, and here you are, unexpectedly appearing." Similarly, we sometimes think about a person, and then suddenly they appear out of nowhere. Likewise, we have intensely and seriously thought about a particular issue, and then suddenly the people we meet start talking to us about the same thing. These cases are too common to be ignored. There is something more intentional and deliberate in such phenomena, where we strongly desire a certain person to do something, and then we suddenly learn that the person has done it. A few years ago, a very popular writer published an article in which he mentioned an event he considered to be a curious case of some form of mental or telepathic influence. He said that he had discovered that if he sat down and carefully wrote a letter to someone he hadn't heard from in a long time, and then destroyed the letter instead of sending it, he was almost sure to receive a letter from that person within a few days. He did not try to explain the phenomenon, simply drawing his readers' attention to this situation. Many people followed this suggestion with very remarkable results. However, there is nothing miraculous or supernatural about these events. It is a phase of telepathy. The focused thought of the letter writer is directed toward the other person, who then begins to think about him, gets the idea to write a letter, and eventually does so. Distance, space, and direction are irrelevant in this experience. In fact, it is not even necessary to know where the other person is located. People are often found with such a close psychic harmony that they are able to ask questions and receive answers from others despite great distances. On other occasions, there is better psychic harmony between the same individuals and not with others, which of course affects the development of the experience. It is surprising to see the wonderful results that anyone with average intelligence can achieve with this sense after practicing carefully, patiently, and responsibly. However, there have been phenomena obtained after a long series of meticulous experiments that are in some ways more astonishing than the experiences just mentioned, and involve fewer elements of chance. I refer to the experiments conducted by a group of serious and cautious scientific students who took precautions against excessive enthusiasm, fraud, and coincidences. Among such research, the work conducted by the Society for Psychical Research in England stands out, as it has established a solid foundation for other researchers to continue their work on this subject following their general methods. In the next chapter, I will provide a more detailed presentation of the results of these studies, as this information is crucial for any student of psychic phenomena. It not only establishes a solid scientific basis for their studies and beliefs, but also provides important information that can be applied in the development of their own experimental work. And I must mention that research on telepathy and other similar subjects, supported by the aforementioned society, was carried out by individuals with rigorous scientific training, extensive experience, and under the general supervision and approval of the society's members. Among these individuals were prominent figures such as Professor Henry Sidgwick of Cambridge University, Professor Balfour Stewart, a member of the Royal Society of England, the Honourable A.J. Balfour, a distinguished English statesman, Professor William James, a renowned American psychologist, Sir William Crookes, a great chemist and discoverer of physical laws, who invented the famous Crookes tubes, without which the discovery of X-rays or radioactivity would have been impossible, Frederick W. Myers, the famous explorer of the astral planes and writer on psychic phenomena, Sir Oliver Lodge, the popular English scientist, and other high-profile individuals with a great international reputation. The character of these personalities lends an air of honesty and scientific precision to the Society's work. To understand the spirit that drove these scientific researchers in their exploration of this new and strange region of nature, it is necessary to carefully read the following words from Sir William Crookes's presidential address before the Royal Society in Bristol, England, in 1898. It is worth recalling that this address was given before an assembly of distinguished scientists, many of whom were high-ranking materialists and rather skeptical about occult phenomena, about 20 years ago. Sir William Crookes, as the president of that meeting, stated the following: "If I were introducing these researches into the world of science for the first time, I would choose a different starting point from the one we have used previously. It would be good to start with telepathy with this fundamental law, because I believe that it is where thoughts and images can be transferred from one mind to another without the intervention of recognized sensory organs, and where knowledge can enter the human mind without being communicated in the manner known or recognized so far. If telepathy occurs, we have two physical facts: the material change in the brain of the emitting subject and the analogous physical change in the brain of the recipient of the suggestion. Between these two material facts, there must exist a chain of physical causes. It is not scientific to resort to mysterious interventions when, with each new advance in knowledge, it is demonstrated that each of the vibrations has powers and attributes abundantly capable of meeting any demand. including the transmission of thought. Some philosophers assume that the essential cells of nerves do not actually touch, but are separated by a narrow gap that widens during sleep and almost disappears during mental activity. This condition is very similar to a coherent of Branly-Olot, a device leading to the discovery of wireless telegraphy, which suggests an additional analogy. Given that the structure of the brain and nerves is similar, it is understandable that there are groups of these nervous coherents in the brain whose function is to receive impulses from the outside through the sequence of atmospheric wave connections, which are organized with a magnitude of vibrations of extreme minuteness. Compared to the smaller waves with which we have had contact so far, there is no reason to assume that we have reached the limit of frequency here. It is known that the action of thought is accompanied by certain molecular movements in the brain, and here we have physical vibrations capable, by their extreme minuteness, of acting directly on individual molecules, while their speed approaches that of the internal and external movements of the atoms themselves. A formidable variety of phenomena must be scientifically selected before we truly understand such a strange, perplexing faculty as the direct action of the mind on itself. In ancient Egyptian times, an inscription known was engraved on the portal of the Temple of Isis: "I am all that has been, is, and will be forever, and no man has yet been able to lift my veil." Is this not how modern seekers of truth confront nature? With firmness and without doubt, we strive to penetrate the innermost heart of nature, to reconstruct what has been, and to prophesy what will be. We have lifted one veil after another, and its face appears more beautiful, venerable, and wonderful with each barrier that is removed. It can be said that this speech, delivered almost 20 years ago and from the perspective of physical science, is in full concordance with the ideas of occultism, which are as old as the hills and mountains. Yet the speaker had prepared the idea independently, and had also explored higher forms of psychic phenomena with results that the world has known. But it is evident that he does not try to attribute any other credit than that of purely physical laws to the ordinary phenomena of telepathy, and in this regard he was entirely right. As we have seen, he avoids the common mistake of confusing the phenomena of physical senses with those of astral senses. Each plane has its own phenomena, and each class is certainly very wonderful. It is again necessary to remember that physical phenomena, like astral phenomena, are purely natural, and that there is no need to seek a supernatural organism to explain them. Scientific telepathy. Researchers at the Society for Psychical Research in England began by providing an extensive definition of telepathy, which is as follows. Telepathy is the communication of any type of impressions from one mind to another, irrespective of recognized sensory channels. They adopted the rational position that the actual distance between the transmitter and the receiver of the telepathic message is not material, and what is required is a separation between the two individuals such that no known sensory operation can bridge the space between them. They wisely argued that telepathy between two people in the same room is equivalent to that of two people located at opposite ends of the world. Researchers thus eliminated all cases of thought transmission in which there was any muscular contact between the transmitter and the receiver. They claimed that, although there might be genuine telepathy in such cases, there was always the possibility of fraud or deception, or unconscious muscular action on the part of the transmitter. They demanded absolute and real separation between the two people to ensure their experiments were free from suspicion. They were wise in this regard, as although there is undoubtedly a psychic communication between the two individuals, as I will explain further, the element of doubt or suspicion must be completely removed from a scientific test for it to be valid and meaningful. Therefore, they limited their telepathy research to two categories. The first concerns actions without physical contact with the desired person, and the second involves guessing a number, word, or card without using any ordinary means of communication. Researchers acknowledged the possibility that within the first category of experiments there might be suspicions of fraud or deception due to unconscious suggestion regarding the movements of the eyes or a limb of the participant, which could be exploited, perhaps unconsciously, by the receiver to guide them towards the object the transmitter had in mind. They attempted to overcome this difficulty by blindfolding the receiver and placing sound-blocking objects on their ears, but ultimately concluded that even these precautions might be insufficient. As a result, they focused their attention on the second category of experiments, where all ordinary means of communication between the transmitter and the receiver were impossible. They took precautions to limit the experiment to a small number of highly reputable researchers, well known to each other, to avoid confusion or errors. One of the early series of experiments conducted by these specialized researchers involved the family of Reverend Emits in Derbyshire, England. The children of this family had gained a great reputation in the game of guessing, where one of the youngest, placed outside the room in advance, would return and try to guess the name or an object that the group had hidden during his absence. The results were very interesting and quite satisfactory, and were frequently mentioned in written works on the subject. I believe it would be good to provide the results of this series of experiments with a bit more detail, as they form a basis for the future work of those who read these lessons. Professor W.F. Barrett, holder of the Chair of Physics at the Royal College of Science in Ireland, conducted most of the experiments. The report to the Society states the following. We started by selecting the simplest objects in the room, then chose names of cities, people, dates, a card or lines from different poems. Essentially anything or series of ideas that the participants could keep constantly in their minds. The children rarely made mistakes. I received 17 cards chosen by myself, correctly named in succession without any error. We quickly realized that it depended greatly on how consistently the ideas were maintained in the minds of the thinkers, and the energy with which they wished these ideas to be transmitted. I can say that this ability is absolutely not limited to members of a family. It is much more general than we imagine. To test this conclusion, I invited the 2 children of a neighbor to join our experiments, obtaining excellent results with them. The report describes the methods of the experiments as follows. The research was conducted at Mr. Seri's house and partly in the rooms of a hotel occupied by some members of our team. After randomly selecting a child whom we wished to remove from the room and waiting at a certain distance, we would choose a card or write on paper the name of a number that came to mind at that moment. Generally, but not always, we showed it to the family members present in the room, although in some cases there were no family members and we were completely alone. Then we would call the youngest child, and one of us always made sure that when the door suddenly reopened, the child was at a considerable distance, although this was generally a superficial concern, as our habit was to avoid any expression of what had been chosen. Upon return, the child would stand beside us, facing the wall, eyes directed to the floor, and generally away from the family for a period of silence, ranging from a few seconds to a minute, until he was called to guess a number, card, or something else. In the initial experiments, in guessing the names of objects, the child correctly identified 6 out of 14 objects. Then, he guessed the names of small things that one of the committee members held in their hands. 5 times out of 6, he guessed fictitious names chosen by the committee, and 5 times out of 10 on the first try. The committee then challenged him by writing the name of a randomly chosen object from the house, and after everyone had thought intensely about the object, we called the child and asked him to try to find the thought of object, while continuing to focus on the thought during the search. The result is reported as follows. Thus I noted, among other things, a comb, an orange, a wineglass, an apple, and so forth, until the child selected and found many objects, ignoring the details of many other experiments. The committee obtained the following remarkable results. A total of 382 trials were conducted in this series. For letters of the alphabet, cards, and 2-digit numbers, the chances of success on a first attempt would naturally be 25 to 1, 52 to 1, and 89 to 1 respectively. In the case of family names, the odds would obviously be infinitely greater. Cards were used very frequently, and the odds in their situation could be considered a fair average sample, according to which, in a full series of 382 trials, the average number of successes on the first attempt by an ordinary guesser would be 7.1. Out of our 127 trials, 56 were successes on the second attempt and 19 on the third out of the 382 possible. One must consider the following. While the law of averages required only 7 1/3 successes on the first attempt, the children achieved 127 successes, which, after a second and third attempt, was increased to 202. As can be seen, this makes the phenomenon completely beyond the scope of mere coincidence or mathematical probability. But that's not all. Listen to the committee's report on this point. The result of one of the series was as follows. The selected object was not revealed to any of the family members, and 5 consecutive cards were correctly named on the first attempt. The odds of this happening once in a series were considerably more than 1,000,000 to 1. Other similar trials were conducted, with the 2 longest recording 8 consecutive successes, one with cards and the other with names, where the adverse odds in the first case were over 142 million to 1, and in the other something incalculable. The opinion of eminent mathematicians who examined the previous results is that the hypothesis of mere coincidence is practically excluded in the scientific review of this matter. The committee draws attention to the fact that, in many of the most significant trials, no member of the Seri family knew the selected object, and thus the hypothesis of fraud or deception is completely eliminated. The committee concluded that the phenomenon was genuine and real telepathy. Professor Balf Stewart, who was present during some of these experiments, although he was not a member of the committee, expressed his great surprise at some of the results. He reports the following. The thought reader was on the other side of a door. The object, the house in which it was thought, was written on a piece of paper and silently handed to the people present in the room. The thought reader was then called, and within a minute the answer was given. Initially, concrete objects in the room were thought of, and in the majority of cases, the answers were correct. Then, numbers were thought of. The responses were generally correct, though some errors naturally occurred. Names of cities were thought of, and a good portion of them were correct. Then, strange names were thought of. I was asked to think of some obscure names, write them down, and hand them to the team. I thought and wrote on a piece of paper, Bluebeard, Little Thumb, Cinderella, and all the answers were correct. The committee also conducted several experiments with other recipients, achieving very satisfactory results. Colors were correctly guessed with a success rate far above the average or probable number. The names of cities from around the world were guessed correctly with a wonderful degree of success. But perhaps the most surprising was the accurate reproduction of diagrams of figures and geometric shapes. In one case, the recipient, during a series of 9 trials, managed to draw them all correctly, although often reversing them, with the top side down and the right side left. The Society published these diagrams in its illustrated reports, and they managed to convince even the most skeptical critics. Some of the diagrams were quite complicated, unusual, and even grotesque, yet they were reproduced with marvelous precision, undoubtedly in a deliberate and continuous manner, as if the recipient were actually copying a drawing before their eyes. Similar results were obtained by other researchers following the example of these original works. As seen, the phenomenon of telepathy now benefits from scientific authority. It is no longer in the realm of the supernatural or the strange. As Camille Flammarion, the eminent French scientist, said, the action of one mind on another, the transmission of thought, mental suggestion, and communication at a distance are more extraordinary than the attraction of the magnet on iron, the influence of the moon on the sea, the transmission of the human voice by electricity, the revolution of the chemical constituents of a star through the analysis of its light, or even all the wonders of contemporary science. These psychic communications are of a higher order and may set us on the path to a type of knowledge about human nature. What is certain is that telepathy can and must now be considered by science as an undeniable reality, that minds are capable of acting on each other without the intervention of the senses, that psychic force exists, although its nature is still unknown. We assert that this force is psychic in nature, not physical, physiological, chemical, or mechanical, because it produces and transmits ideas and thoughts and manifests itself without the cooperation of our senses, between souls, from mind to mind. In addition to studying the types of telepathic phenomena mentioned previously, the Society for Psychical Research in England examined many important cases of a higher phase of telepathy. They recorded the accounts of responsible individuals and then examined them carefully before questioning witnesses of strange phenomena. The record of these experiments and inquiries forms a considerable number of books and reports from the Society, which are worth reading by all students of the subject. They can be found in libraries in almost every major city. However, I will select a few of the most interesting cases to give my students an idea of the nature of the phenomena studied, considered authentic by the committees responsible for this class of telepathy. An interesting case of spontaneous telepathy is the one reported by Dr. Eade. Here is the account. There is a house near mine, inhabited by ladies who are friends of our family. They have a large alarm bell outside their house. One night I woke up suddenly and said to my wife, "I'm sure I hear Mrs. F's alarm bell." After listening for a while, we heard nothing, and I went back to sleep. The next day, Mrs. F called my wife and said, "Last night we wanted to see your husband because thieves alarmed us. We were all awake, and I almost rang the alarm bell hoping he would hear it, saying to my daughters, 'I'm sure he'll soon bring Dr. Eade.' But we didn't ring it. My wife asked me what time this happened, and Mrs. F replied that it was around 1:30 a.m. At that time, I had woken up thinking I had heard the bell. In this case, it was simply ordinary telepathy on the physical plane. If the bell had actually rung and been heard psychically, it would have been a case of clairaudience on the astral plane. However, Mrs. F's mere thought and strong desire to ring the bell caused a transmission of thought waves that struck Dr. Eade with great force and woke him up. This situation is interesting, as it is typical of many cases of a similar nature. In the experience of many people, a strong emotion or excitement, accompanied by a powerful desire or will to call another person, can give great power and effect to the emitted thought waves. They strike the recipient's mind like the sudden sound of an alarm bell. Another interesting case involves two ladies, both well known to the members of the Commission and approved after a strict review. This case is unusual due to the fact that two different people received the thought waves simultaneously. Here is a summary of the case. Mrs. G and her sister had spent the night at their mother's house, who was ill. In the middle of the night, the sister woke up frightened and told her husband that she needed to see her mother immediately, requesting a carriage, as she was convinced her mother was seriously ill. On the way to their mother's house, where two paths crossed, she saw Mrs. G's carriage arriving. When they met, each asked the other why she was there. They both described the same experience and what they were feeling. Upon arriving at their mother's house, they discovered that she was dying and had expressed a powerful desire to see them. A similar case is as follows. During the attack on Moulton, Brigadier General R, then aide-de-camp of his regiment, was severely wounded and thought he was going to die. He asked for his ring to be removed and sent to his wife. At the same time, his wife was at Ferros Rope, 240,000 kilometers away, lying in bed in a state between wakefulness and sleep. She saw how her husband was evacuated from the battlefield and heard his voice saying, "Take this ring off my finger and send it to my wife." This case exhibits the characteristics of very strong telepathy, but also resembles clairvoyance accompanied by clairaudience, or perhaps a combination of telepathy and clairvoyance. It is impossible to determine which is more relevant without more detailed information. Messages from dying people or those who believe they are approaching death often have great strength for reasons well known to occultists, but there is nothing supernatural about these phenomena, and in most cases, it is a case of strong telepathy. The Society also reports the following case. A man was awake and had a strong will to communicate with two friends who were asleep at 1 a.m. when he met them a few days later. Both told him that at 1 a.m. they had woken up with the impression that he was in their room. The experience was so real that they could not fall back asleep for some time and checked their watches to note the time. Such cases are quite common, and those who have experienced them have had good results with this phase of thought transfer. It should be noted that in most of these cases, there is no actual projection of the astral body, but simply a strong impression caused by concentrated thought. Another interesting case involves the late Bishop Wilberforce, recorded in his biography. The story is as follows. The bishop was in his library at Cudder's with 3 or 4 of his clerks at the same table. Suddenly he put his hand to his head and exclaimed, "I'm sure something has happened to one of my sons." Later it was discovered that at that exact moment his eldest son's foot was severely injured in an accident aboard his ship at sea. The bishop himself mentioned the circumstance in a letter to Miss Noel, saying, "It is very curious that at the time of the accident I was so overwhelmed by the thought that something bad had happened to my son Herbert, that I ended up noting that I could not shake the impression that something had happened to him, and I wrote it down to remember later." This case is not unusual, as it has been repeated in the lives of many people. Its main importance lies in the fact that it is recorded by a man of wide reputation and high rank, and also because the bishop took the precaution of noting the event at the moment it occurred, rather than simply recalling it later. After learning about the accident, one can observe that in many cases of this type, the phenomenon approaches true clairvoyance or astral perception. In certain situations, there seems to be a blend of telepathy and astral clairvoyance. Indeed, there is very little difference between the highest stages of ordinary telepathy and the most common stages of clairvoyance. Here, as in many other cases involving the forces of nature, there appears to be a gradual blending rather than a clear-cut boundary between the two types of phenomena. Furthermore, a student who develops their telepathic abilities will find that over time they will begin to exhibit occasional flashes of clairvoyance. In the case of telepathy, the receiver perceives only what is in the mind of the sender. In some instances, an image in the sender's mind may be seen by the receiver and mistaken for a case of pure clairvoyance. However, upon thorough investigation, it becomes apparent that the actual scene was slightly different from the impression, demonstrating that the impression was merely telepathic. Clairvoyant vision shows the scene as it is in reality, or rather, as it would be observed by the receiver's physical sight. Astral vision actually sees the scene and is not limited to receiving the sender's mental impression. The former is an original vision, while the latter is merely a reproduction of images already present in the sender's mind and colored by their personality. In the next lesson, I will propose a series of exercises and methods designed to develop telepathic powers. Practicing these exercises will be both interesting and entertaining, while also highly instructive. As you practice these exercises, you will become increasingly skilled and adept at producing telepathic phenomena. From the lower stages, you will be able to progress to the higher ones, and over time, you will be surprised to discover, almost unconsciously, that you have reached a stage where you will have at least occasional manifestations of clairvoyance or psychometry. In reality, there is no better method known among practical occultists for developing clairvoyant abilities in a student than this initiation method with exercises designed to develop telepathic power. Centuries of experience have proven that a student who systematically develops telepathic power will progressively develop and evolve clairvoyant and psychometric abilities, which are the initial steps towards psychic development. Under the heading of clairvoyance, methods and exercises will be proposed to develop clairvoyant powers, some of which are very valuable and effective. However, I believe it is necessary to emphasize the importance of laying a solid foundation for this teaching by first developing in the field of telepathic power. This course will not only enhance the abilities to receive desired vibrations, but will also train the mind to translate, interpret, and record these impressions. It is important to remember that mastery of a mental art is achieved through the training of attention to focus on a task. The same applies to clairvoyance and psychometry. Telepathy trains your attention to focus on receiving impressions and to hold them firmly and clearly in consciousness. The result of this development of clairvoyant receptivity is that attention is trained to accomplish the necessary work. There is no need to mention the advantage this provides over a clairvoyant who has not received this training, as it can be inferred by common sense. Therefore, telepathy training will now continue, not only in this field, but also as a means of preparation for higher stages.